welcome everyone back again to another system, which is the nervous system. Today is the first lecture in this system, and it just will be introduction to the system, and we will define the organization of that system. So we will not dig deep. So this is just to know how the nervous system organized, how we divide it, and just briefly about different parts in the nervous system. So when you hear nervous system, I think what comes first to your mind is that the nervous system divided into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. And maybe you know from first year in your study that the central nervous system composed from the brain and from the spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system composed from the cranial nerves. That mean the nerves come out from the brain and nerves come out from the spinal cord. That means cranial nerves and spinal nerves respectively. Plus, the peripheral nervous system also includes not just the cranial and spinal nerves, but also aggregation of neurons outside the central nervous system called ganglion, right? So also, maybe you remember from the GI system that there is an enteric plexus in a small intestine, as you see here, that controls the mobility and the diameter of the lumen of the small intestine. So up to now you have central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Yes, but I think it's good to remind you guys about the functions of the nervous system. Simply, as of today, we took an example about your colleague when I asked her to drop off the phone from her hand, right? So I talked to her. I asked her to drop the phone from her hand. That means she received the message. That because I said. So hearing also, guys, is an sensation. So she heard what I said. That means one of the nervous system is the sensory input, not just hearing also. When you, for example, handle a hot spoon, right? So in this case, it's hot. You feel it. It's a stimuli, right? So these stimuli, the sensations, whatever you see is a sensation also you received, whatever you hear also. So these are sensations you received it. So one of the functions of the nervous system is a sensory input. Now your colleague, once she heard me, the message, she got the message while she heard what I said, then she processed what I said in her mind. So the brain interprets and processed what I said. So she understood that I'm talking about the phone that she handled. So this is the second function, that integration, understand what's going on, interpret the message, interpret the stimuli, interpret or understand that, for example, you handle a hot spoon or whatever. So this is the second function. Now, what's the third function? Well, of course, there are many functions other than those listed here, but the third function was she dropped off the phone from her hand, right? That means she understood, the brain processed the message, and now the time of the action. So the brain sent message to the your hand to grab the phone and move your hand and put it like that means you are using now skeletal muscle, right, to put the phone in her pocket or in her backpack, for example. So this is the motor output, the motor response, and would be usual to the muscles and a gland. But we mentioned that already, we explained that. Now I would like to pay your attention to the functional classification of peripheral nervous system. Yes, we said that the central nervous system, brain, and a spinal cord. Yes, inside the brain and spinal cord, there are regions for sensory, motor, emotion, and for example, auditory area for hearing, and Broca's area for speech, and motor area, sensory area, and so forth, for sensation and for motor action. And in the peripheral nervous system, also in the spinal cord, sorry, when you take a cross section of spinal cord, you will see there is pathways. Axons pass from here and there, some of them for sensation, some of them for carry motor impulses and orders. On the other hand, there are nuclei here, so different kind of nuclei. So there is a lot of information you have to know in the next couple of lectures. But now there is also subdivision for peripheral nervous system. Functional classification, that means something related to the function of the peripheral nervous system. For example, take this message. You see somebody here, right? You create an image. You received, the vision is a sensation, right? So this scene or the picture that you see or the vision will be transmitted as a sensation through nerve fibers. That means there are nerve fibers that carry sensation, information, whatever, toward the central nervous system, to the brain and the spinal cord. For example, you handle again a hot spoon, right? So it's hot. That means you will get the message. The sensation will be carried from your skin through nerve fibers, not through the eye, sorry, to the nerve fibers to the spinal cord and brain. That means to the central nervous system. Now the action should be, now the brain will interpret and process that message or stimuli. But before that, let us finish it. That means you have sensory fiber. Why? Yes, they are nerve fibers, but they carry the sensation toward the central nervous system. We call them afferent, which is important. On the other hand, there is another nerve fibers, but their function is to carry the message and the impulse and the order from the central nervous system to the peripheral. So they are nerve fibers related to, we can call them, or related to the motor division. So these nerve fibers are efferent fibers. That means efferent, that means carry orders, impulses from the central nervous system toward the periphery or away from the central nervous system. And this is important. So we call them efferent nerve fibers or motor division. But in this functional classification, I'm talking about now the motor. This kind of impulses or order that carried from the central nervous system toward the periphery, do you think it's just for skeletal muscles? Do you think it's just for something voluntary? No. It can be also these kind of nerve fibers and the orders they have can be also transmitted to smooth muscles, right? Like, for example, the intestine or cardiac muscle, which is out of your control, or for glands, which is out of your control. That means the motor division can be, or the efferent can be divided into two subdivisions. As I mentioned, somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Somatic, which is for skeletal muscle, like when you handle again a hot spoon, so the brain sends message to your hand, to skeletal muscle, to drop off the spoon from your hand. This is a response. It's somatic. You have a control over it. That's why we call it somatic. But somatic يعني جسمي, which is voluntary. But the other division, which is autonomic nervous system, which is out of your control. It is involuntary, لا إرادي. You don't have a control over it. For example, again to the example of the spoon, right? So it's hot, so now you throw it, but because it's very hot, you got anxious, you get nervous, you got pain. So there is a kind of response also from central nervous system to smooth muscle, maybe to the cardiac muscle. For example, to the cardiac muscle, which is out of your control. Now you got increase in your heart rate because it's painful. It's like sudden and something like that. You got sweating hand, for example, or sweating at all in your body. So again, the glands out of your control. So the autonomic nervous system can be divided into sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric nervous system. Sympathetic, when you got anxious because you handle a hot spoon, so you got increase in the heart rate. But on the other hand, if you are happy, you eat very well and you're relaxed, so the heart rate will be decreased. That means the parasympathetic will control the situation, right? And you will have like increase in the secretion of your intestine. You are so happy. On the other hand, the autonomic nervous system also includes the enteric nervous system, as I mentioned earlier, which is for example, smooth muscle and the glands in the GI tract, right? Now, this is again the nervous system, the function of the nervous system that controls, or we consider the central of all your mental activity. So your brain, of course, and nervous system in general is like the source of your thoughts. It's for learning. It I would say shows your behavior. You have a memory there. You get like different stimuli. You respond to different situations, different cases in your daily life. So furthermore, the nervous system also cooperates with the, for example, endocrine system to response and maintain and regulate the homeostasis in your body. Like, for example, when you get thirsty or hungry, that means there are sensations carried to the brain and so forth, and there's a kind of secretions. So there is a collaboration between the nervous system and different system in your body, including, of course, the endocrine system. Now, the nervous, when you say nervous system, that means you are talking about, you remember, or what comes to your mind, of course, there is a nervous tissue. And when you say nervous tissue, when you take like a slide under the microscope, yes, there are a couple of structures there, but most importantly and mainly you will get neurons and supporting cells called glia cells. So there are mainly two types of cells in the nervous tissue. You have neurons and you have a neuroglia. Neurons is the main structural functional unit, is the most important, is the functional unit of the nervous system. Say, for example, when you say nephrons in the kidneys is the functional units, and here, guys, in the nervous system, in the nervous tissue, you have the neurons, اللي هو خلية العصبية, neuron, right? Or you can say nerve cell. You can say nerve cell or neurons, but mainly we use neurons, right? This is a neuron. On the other hand, the neuron or neurons need to be supported, need to be nourished, need to be held by other assistants. So the help comes from, or the support comes from another serving cells called neuroglia cells. They are located around it and around the blood vessels here and there. There are a couple of types of glia cells. Glia, that means glue. It comes from a glue. that supports and glue to each other and to the neurons, like make a support to the nervous tissue and so forth. So glia from, if you remember, super glue. Yes, it's a glue. So neurons, of course, have different shape and size. You will get more about different type of neurons and the glia cells in the histology in the next lecture. But for now, this is important. You have to know that it was believed or thought that the neurons are connecting to each other. They are connected. They are one wire, right? They thought, but that wasn't true. Recently, they discovered, like recently, I'm saying before 150 years ago or more, they found out that, for example, this is an axon of the neuron, and this is the dendrite of other neuron. So they are not one part. They are contacting to each other, but there is a space between them, right? So we are talking about contiguity, contact. They are contact to each other, but not continuity. They are not one continuous wire, not one continuous layer. You can't say, oh, this is a axon and this is dendrite. They are connected, adhere, like one part. No, they are not one part. There is a gap in between. So there is no continuity in the nervous system. There is a neurotransmitter released here in this gap. We call it synapse, which is important also. And then the neurotransmitter transmitters, of course, they have receptors on the other side, and then the impulse will transmitted in this way from electrical, chemical again, electrical, right? So this is important. Okay, let me give you a brief introduction about the neuron. Not that much to say, because in the next lecture, the histology will take more and more details, but this is a fluorescent photo of the neuron. This neuron, I would say, it's multipolar neuron because it has many processes comes out from it. So again, the neuron is the basic structural, anatomical, functional, and biological unit, which is important, right? And here is another type of neuron, unipolar neuron, because there is one stem comes out from it, mainly. So you have around 100 billion neurons. But also you have supporting cells here, which is glia cells, right? For different function, we'll talk about it, which is about 10 times than the neurons. Okay, that was about neuron. But what's the story of glia cells? Again, briefly, we'll talk about it now. And here, guys, there are a couple of types of neuroglia cells. For example, this is a neuron, right? Or nerve cell. This is the neuron, and this is the axon. But look, the axon is myelinated, covered by myelin sheath. مغطى بغمد مليني. This myelin sheath created in the central nervous system by oligodendrocyte. What's the oligodendrocyte? It's one type of neuroglia. Okay, here is an astrocyte in the green that, controls the blood flow to the brain, and also buffering the potassium and glutamate neurotransmitters. So it buffers these kind of chemicals to regulate the function of and help the function of neurons. So astrocyte, again, another type of neuroglia. What we have here also microglia, also antibodies, which is similar to the white PC in the bloodstream, but here is microglia in the brain. So it exists from the embryonic period. Again, microglia, another type of neuroglia. So ependymal cells, kind of cells adheres, or these cells adhere to each other in tight junction. They lines the ventricles. In your brain you have cavities, right? So ependymal cells like lines, this kind of cavities. We'll talk more about that when you take the lecture about ventricles and CSF and so forth. So this kind of ependymal cells, kind of glia cells. So these kind, what you see here, all they are supporting the function of neurons, and they are essential for supporting and nutrition of neurons, as I mentioned. So we are so thankful for glia cells, but unfortunately, well, you have to know, this is important, right? That neuroglia cells divide. So glia cells divide, but neurons, no, mainly they don't divide. That means when you lose your neurons, they will not be replaced. There is no division, which is important, right? But the neuroglia cells, astrocyte, oligodendrocyte, and so forth, can be regenerated and can be replaced. That means there is a division. But the price of this division of our neuroglia is a brain tumor. That means most brain tumors come from neuroglia cells, but not neurons, which is important. So now there are, I would say, a couple of terms I would like you to know. There is a kind of nucleus. Maybe you heard about nucleus in the cells, but here's like in the brain is a kind of something different. So you know neurons, when the neurons or cell bodies of neurons aggregate or gathered or grouped in the inside the central nervous system, we call them nucleus. That means this is a cell body of neuron, a cell body of neurons. So they are aggregated like this. They form like a nucleus. For example, look to the caudate nucleus here. Caudate nucleus. So this inside the brain and the spinal cord, when you find the aggregation of neurons inside the white matter, inside the brain, because you know this is a cerebral cortex. All you know, this is a cerebral cortex that contains cell bodies of neurons. That's fine. But when you get in, there is a white matter here. So aggregation of nerve cell bodies here inside the brain and spinal cord, for example, this, and for example, here and here. So these kind of aggregations called nucleus. But if these kind of groups of neurons or the cell bodies of these neurons aggregates also before that, this is a spinal cord, right? So it's a white matter here, and there is a gray matter like a butterfly. Again, we talk about brain and spinal cord. That means central nervous system. Look at these nuclei. These are also aggregation of cell bodies of neurons. Cell bodies of neurons. Why I'm saying cell bodies of neurons? Because you know the neuron has cell body, dendrites, and axons. So mainly the nuclei formed by the cell bodies, right? Not the axons, cell bodies of neurons. Again, in the spinal cord, they form like a nuclei, like nucleus proprius, substantia gelatinosa, phrenic nucleus, so accessory nucleus, and so forth. But somebody can say, yes, but what about the neurons if they are aggregated outside the central nervous system? We call them ganglion. This is guys important, right? So look at the spinal cord. Out of brain and spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system. So anyway, in peripheral or not, the aggregation of cell bodies of neurons outside the brain and spinal cord, outside the central nervous system, we call them ganglion, right? This is again cell bodies of neurons here, but outside we call them ganglion. This is important. Another two terms, guys, tracts. Tract, that means pathways، يعني طرق عصبية. It's like wires or pathways for wires, axons. So when the nerve fibers or axons of neurons gathered and pass in one location, they create a kind of a tract. For example, this is a cross section of the spinal cord, right? So look at this tract. You know, the sensory is blue color, while the motor tract red color. That means you have sensory tract and motor tract. That means when you for example sense or for example again handle a hot spoon, say, you get sensations. These sensations will be carried through, of course, you have here neurons, cell body of a neuron, and this is the axon of afferent neuron. The sensations will be carried through the sensory pathways, right? And in this case, as far as I remember, through the spinothalamic tract, right? So through the sensory tract, while the stimuli, once it reaches the brain gives an order to take off your hand, right? And throw the spoon. So again, this is the brain, and that region, for example, the motor region, the first, the sensation comes to the sensory. Then the motor, there is a cell body here, there is billions of cell bodies, or neurons, I mean, but there is a tract. Here is the axons. These axons, motor axons, carry the impulse and order to your hand to drop off the spoon. So this tract is a motor tract, like this, lateral corticospinal tract. So this is a kind, so the tract is a group of axons, aggregates or grouped in a region, right? On the other hand, that's in central, within the central nervous system. Again, this is important. Now, what about the group of nerves? I mean axons again, but outside the central nervous system. They create a nerve, like ulnar nerve, median nerve. Take a cross section. When you take a cross section at the end, of course, you will dig deep in that in the next lecture. But for now, look, this is the nerve fiber or the axon. So, like large number of these axons gathered to form outside the central nervous system to form a nerve. So this is, you can read it. And so the brain, your brain, because if it's important system, so, and the brain especially, it deserves to be protected because it controls most of your body, most of your actions. So the brain is protected by bone, we call the cranial bone. Here is the skull, right? And not just bones, it's also covered by meninges. These meninges called the cranial meninges for the brain, but in the spinal cord called spinal meninges. Anyway, here's, you have, guys, cranial meninges. You have it three. Let us have a look here. Again, this is the bone, cranial bone. Deep to it, look at the green color here. This is the first one, dura mater, which is 2 layers, سموها الأم الجافية, away from the brain. And you have another, deep to it, there is another layer, the purple, I think, which is arachnoid matter. This is the arachnoid matter. It sends kind of trabecula. You see these trabecula, مثل العنكبوت, called arachnoid matter, الأم العنكبوت. Deep to it, there is another layer that adheres to the brain itself. You see the red color, it adheres to the brain itself. Even in cadaver, it's very difficult to take it out. So this is the pia mater, الأم الحنون, because it attaches to the brain. Look at the space between them, between the pia mater and arachnoid matter. also here arachnoid matter and pia matter. So this space, it's below the arachnoid matter, so it's called subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space filled with CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. So this is another mechanism by which the brain is protected, not just the bone, not just the cranial meninges, but also there is a fluid here. That means the brain, say like this, and this is your brain that's flowed, and there's CSF here, right? So it's a mechanical, it's a kind of approach or a mechanism to protect the brain from physical insults, like when you put something inside a fluid. So mainly it's a protective. So yes, this is also important. Now when you the meninges, the cranial meninges also in the brain descends to the spinal cord, and now they call the spinal meninges. You have dura, arachnoid matter, and pia matter, but the dura matter here is just one layer. Okay, again, because this lecture is an introduction, so briefly, of course you will dig deep in everything of these terms, but just briefly, the brain composed, the regions of the brain mainly composed from cerebral hemispheres. You have right cerebral hemisphere and left cerebral hemisphere. So this is the cerebrum. This is the left cerebral hemisphere, right? And you have a cerebellum. This is the cerebellum. You have a brainstem. This is the brainstem, composed from 3 parts. And you have diencephalon, which is located between the 2 cerebral hemispheres, including the thalamus, which is the sensory station. Most of the sensation in your body has to come first, or have to come first to the thalamus. Just below and anterior to the thalamus, you have hypothalamus. Again, you have below the thalamus, you have subthalamus, which is like lens-like structure, which is considered part sometime from the it's not sometime, it's really part from basal ganglia that controls the movement of the muscle in your body. So it's called the subthalamus. And you have epithalamus, including pineal gland and hapinular nucleus. Now, let me talk to you a little bit briefly about the cerebrum. So this is the brain superior view, and this is the cerebrum. We call it cerebrum, يعني المخ, right? So look at it here. You see this convoluted structure here. This is gyrus, and this is another gyrus. This is another gyrus, and this is another. So these are gyri. So the plural of gyrus is gyri, right? Folded, convoluted structure. But if you look again to these gyri, you will see that they are separated by shallow grooves. This one, shallow grooves. That means not deep. We call them, this is sulcus, and this is sulcus, and this is sulcus. So all of these are sulci. So you have a gyri separated, or separated mainly, but not completely, of course, by sulci. So for example, this is a cross section from both cerebral hemispheres here. Look at the gyrus here. This is one gyrus, convoluted. Another gyrus here, gyrus here. So these gyri, between these gyri, look, there is a small shallow grooves called sulci. Why? But before say why, but let us have a look on this deep groove, which is we call it fissure, right? شق يعني. So this is the median longitudinal fissure or longitudinal fissure. When it's deep, we call it fissure. Now, I think it's good to remind you that look why the cerebral cortex and these gyri are like convoluted like this. Indeed, this cerebral cortex, this one, the gray part here, the cerebral cortex was about 1 to 2 millimeters. This is the most important structure, I would say, in the cerebrum. Of course, there are many structures, but indeed, if you unfold this, it takes like this distant. But when you convolute it or fold it, it takes like this space. So to increase the surface of the cerebral cortex, the brain convoluted and make like gyri and sulci and convoluted folded like this, which is very similar to the hand fan, right? You cannot carry it all the time like this, but you can fold it to create something like small like this. So briefly again, just ABC about the cerebrum before the next couple of lectures. You will dig deep in that. The cerebrum divided into lobes. You have a frontal lobe. Posterior to it and behind the central sulcus, you have parietal lobe. Posterior and inferior to it, you have occipital lobe. And laterally, you have temporal lobe. On the other hand, you have another, I would say, isolated area, if it's correct to say, but there is a kind of controversy between authorities. Some authorities consider it like what we call, I'm talking about the insula. You have to open the two lips of the lateral fissure here, open the this fissure. So you remove the superior temporal gyrus here, remove the frontal and parietal. So you open the two lips here to get in deep and see the insula. But in a cross section, you can see it anyway. So some authorities consider it like a lobe, separate lobe. But other authorities, they consider it part of temporal lobe, which is up to you. Now, again, to cerebrum, and here look at this section, coronal section of the brain. You see outside you have a gray matter here, the gray matter that forms the cerebral cortex, right? And deep to it you have relatively white matter here. This is white matter, right? This is a white matter. If you take a cross section, why it's gray and why it's white? Indeed, the cerebral cortex, if the gray matter, guys, that forms the cerebral cortex, it's gray because of the cell bodies and dendrites of the axons. So the cerebral cortex, if you take a cross section, the histology to the cerebral cortex, you will see that here is, guys, in the cerebral cortex, you have cell bodies, while their axons moved inferiorly, right? Not really inferiorly, but moved deep from cerebral cortex. That's why, because you know the cell bodies of neurons and dendrites are unmyelinated. They are unmyelinated. That means because you know the myelin sheath is white color, right? But the cell bodies and dendrites are unmyelinated, then the cerebral cortex takes a kind of gray shape, while their axons here are myelinated. You see this purple color? This is myelin sheath, right? So it's a kind of white color. Then this area seen as a white color. This is a white matter. So axons and myelinated axons, right? Myelinated axons. Of course, there is a neuroglia in both cerebral cortex and white matter and the blood vessels in both. So this is important, right? So briefly, again, there is a lecture about diencephalon, but I think we talked about that previously in the previous slides. And the brainstem here, the brainstem composed from three parts: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So pons, it means like a bridge, which is between the midbrain and medulla oblongata. So it's the bridge between midbrain and medulla oblongata. Now, you know that the brain stem, when you look to the brain stem, so most of, I would say, axons from the brain and cerebellum, pathways, nerve fibers should pass through the brain stem from the brain and cerebellum to the spinal cord, right? So it's a pathway. Plus, if you have a look here to the brainstem, you will see that about 10 nerves, not about, indeed 10 nerves, except the first one and the second one, olfactory and optic nerve. All other nerves, the 10 nerves, 10 out of 12, of course, emerge. They have a nuclei there in the brainstem, and they emerge from the brainstem and supply most different structures and parts in the head and neck, plus like vagus nerve to the thorax and abdomen. Cerebellum, located in the posterior inferior surface or area in the cranium. If you say this is the skull, right? So the cerebellum, there is a lecture about cerebellum, of course, but for now, you have to know that the cerebellum, its function not to control and move the muscles. No, its function is coordination. Coordinate the skeletal muscle contraction. Already, your brain, your motor area, controls the the skeletal muscles, for example. But this kind of contraction should be smooth, should be coordinated, should be adjusted, more power, less power, and so forth. This is the job of cerebellum, المخيخ. So it maintains coordinated skeletal muscle contraction and maintains also not just muscle tone, but also your posture and balance. How to walk, how not to fall down, for example. So this is the function of the cerebellum. Yes, in the spinal cord, this is a posterior view of the spinal cord. You see that the spinal cord associated with 31 pairs. Pay attention, pairs. Because on the right and on the left, you have 8. Yeah, that means plus 1. You have 7 vertebrae, but here you have 8 pairs in the cervical. But you have 12 in the thoracic, 12 pairs. Thoracic nerves, you have 5 in the lumbar, and you have 5 in the sacral and 1 coccygeal. So they are 31 pairs. That was about spinal cord. Now back to the brain. It's good to know that cavities exist in different regions in your body, including the brain. The brain has cavities. Yes, it has cavities. Cavities filled with cerebrospinal fluid. These cavities, you remember the heart? The heart has atrium or atria and ventricles. So this ventricle or cavity, so the ventricles come from the cavities, right? So also in the brain, you have ventricles, cavities in the brain. So filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So this is a lateral view of the ventricles you have in your body. So you have 2 lateral ventricles one on the right, which is like C shape, and one on the left, right? So two lateral ventricles. Where's the third one? Because you have four ventricles, one lateral on the right, one on the left. So the cerebrospinal fluid that formed in the ventricles, now in the lateral ventricles, passed to the third ventricle. There is one third ventricle through the interventricular foramina, because you have one here and one here. So the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, drained to the third. Now from the third, the CSF will drain to the fourth ventricle here through the cerebral aqueduct. There is a lecture about ventricles and CSF flow, but just don't rush yourself. Just take an idea. So the cerebrospinal fluid will, again, now from fourth ventricle through two openings, lateral and medial, will be circulated around the brain in the subarachnoid space, right, and around the spinal cord, but also not just around the brain and spinal cord, but also inside the central canal itself. In the spinal cord, you have a central canal. So here's, guys, which is filled with CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. So this is a slide about the cerebrospinal fluid. Again, just briefly, the cerebrospinal fluid, not just to protect the brain, as I mentioned earlier at the first of the slides, but also it carries oxygen, CO2, glucose, important substance to the brain. So it's produced in the ventricles through a network of capillaries called choroid plexus. Choroid plexus. So that means from blood capillaries, that means the components of CSF is very close to the plasma of the blood, very close to it, right? And it's about 150 millimeter. In another textbook, they say 200 millimeter in the adult, right? So this is important. That means if somebody withdraws all the CSF, it's about 150 millimeter. Now, just briefly, again, there is a lecture about that, but here's a transverse section through the brain. Look at it here. So you are looking to the right lateral ventricle and left lateral ventricle. Imagine, amazing, really, ventricles in the brain, separated by septum pellucidum here. But there is an opening here, you see? There's an opening here, you see? This is the interventricular foramen. So the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, produced here. You see this kind of things here? Capillaries. These kind of capillaries called choroid plexuses. Let us take a cross section through choroid plexus. Yes, there is a blood vessels here, network of blood vessels, but covered by ependymal cells. Do you remember the glia cells kind of attached by tie junction, right? So the CSF produced from the plasma of your blood. So that's why it's very close to the components and concentrations of your blood, except a couple of things. So it's leaked through the ependymal cells itself and reached to the ventricles here. That means leaked from here and produced here. So again here, and then circulated from interventricular foramen to the third ventricle and fourth ventricle and so forth. So I'm not going to talk about the CSF flow because there is a lecture about CSF flow. It's too much, and also I'm not going to, you can read it for yourself because there is too much now. There is a lecture about ventricles and CSF flow, but just briefly, because you have an idea about the choroid plexuses that's in the lateral ventricles and third ventricle and fourth ventricle, they are produce CSF. Mainly, all they produce, all choroid plexuses in all ventricles are produced, but mainly those of lateral ventricle produce the majority of CSF. Anyway, if there is overproduction of CSF, or at the same time, if there is less absorption, right? If there is overproduction or decreased absorption of CSF, the result will be enlargement of the ventricle, as you see here, and enlargement of the brain and head, something called hydrocephalus أو استسقاء الدماغ يعني بالعربي, right? Hydrocephalus. Sometimes because of obstruction of kind of an opening through the CSF flow can cause this kind of like congenital anomalies, for example, the opening like obstructed or so forth, so there's accumulation of CSF or overproduction or whatever. So all of these factors can cause something called hydrocephalus, which is important. Now, the autonomic nervous system, there is a lecture about, I think the last lecture in the system will be about the autonomic nervous system, but I would like just to talk briefly about it, in which the autonomic nervous system, that's something you have no control over it. And as I mentioned earlier, it's composed from sympathetic and parasympathetic system. So sympathetic, when you fired up or fight and flight, for example, when you are anxious, when you are angry and so forth, stimulated. But it's counteracted, opposite to it, I mean, is the parasympathetic system, which is rest and digest. Just to remember it, for example, when you eat and you are happy, so you stretch yourself and you are so happy, so relaxed, your heart rate is slow, you're breathing slowly, not like sympathetic. But they have components. Their components are in the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. What does it mean? So the sympathetic, that's a green color. I think here I would use this. Okay. So look at the green color, which is the sympathetic nervous system. So it originates from fibers or in the sections of spinal cord in the thoracic and upper lumbar. From the thoracic, all thoracic section of spinal cord, and the first two lumbar, I think L1 and L2. That's why it's called thoracolumbar outflow. From the thoracic and lumbar section of spinal cord, the fibers of sympathetic system come out, right? But on the other hand, the parasympathetic system come out from the brain and the last part of spinal cord, the sacral part, from S2 to S4 here. That's why it's called craniosacral outflow. Craniosacral. For example, in the brain, the fibers come out from the brainstem. They join cranial nerves number 3, 7, 9, and 10. So cranial part and sacral part, that was called the craniosacral outflow. These are fibers of parasympathetic system. I think I prefer to wait until the last lecture about the sympathetic system, and don't rush yourself. But I think, you know, the autonomic nervous system, of course, has a control over something that involuntary. So you don't have control over it. It's because it's automatic, I mean. So the autonomic nervous system innervates smooth muscle. You don't have control over it. Cardiac muscle, glands. So it controls or play an important part in the hemostatic mechanism in your body, of course, with collaboration with endocrine system. Yes, here is an MRI sagittal section. Let us define different structures here. Okay, let me use this pen, I think. Okay. Here is, guys, what you see is the cerebrum. Just briefly, because there is a lecture about cerebrum, gyri, and different structures here, but just briefly now. So this is the cerebrum. This is a cortex you see here, right? And here is should be the location of lateral ventricle. You remember the lateral ventricle? And inside the lateral ventricle, there is a CSF. It's white in color because there is a fluid here, right? There is a CSF. So this is a location of lateral ventricle. Inside there's a nucleus, you call it nucleus. Forget that until you get to it. So this is the thalamus. This is the cerebellum, posterior inferior in the cranium, right? This is the cerebellum. Again, this is anteriorly, right? And this is posteriorly. Let me show you another MRI. Here's again sagittal section. Again, this is the frontal lobe here. This is a parietal lobe. This is the occipital lobe, and this is the cerebellum. This is the thalamus, right? And here is the corpus callosum with 4 parts. I'm not going to talk about it now. So this is the location of septum pellucidum and lateral ventricle if you go deep there. Again, this is the thalamus, but now the brainstem. This is the first part of brainstem, midbrain. This is pons. Look at the bulge here. So this is a landmark to the bone, and this is the medulla oblongata, right? What else? This is coronal section. That means, let me see. Okay. You take a cross section through here, right? Coronal section. So again, there's another. Here is the longitudinal fissure, right, and left cerebral hemispheres, mainly the frontal ones, I think. And here is the ventricles. You can see is this one's the lateral ventricle on the right and on the left, and divided by septum pellucidum. And still you cannot see the thalamus, not yet. Okay, here is the lateral fissure. This is the temporal lobe here, and here is part of midbrain. And I think it's enough for now, and thank you guys.